I do, but
First of all,
we don't.
Gus does.
First of all, I do. Second of all,
And if you don't like that, come see me.
Second of all, I think I've been starting with my picks first, so I want to start with Psycho this time, and I'll turn it to you, and we'll tell me what you think.
Let's just get right into it, dude.
Tell me a story.
I'm gonna tell you a story about a woman named Lila Crane. All right. No, I'm not gonna do that. I'm not gonna listen. Psycho is a classic. It came out. First of all, it came out in 1960.
It goes without saying.
It's been a classic from the beginning, but really, what completes Psycho, we don't have to say that Alfred Hitchcock is a genius. Obviously, the dude is a genius.
Yes.
But what makes Psycho is, first of all, it pushes boundaries. And maybe not for us today, but at the time that it was made, it showed a whole lot of stuff on screen that people weren't necessarily comfortable seeing.
Yes.
From the world famous shower scene to it has a lot of like sexual connotations. It has, for the time, one of the most violent scenes that had been shown on film.
Yep. There's a lot of voyeurism that people were super
Yeah, exactly.
Dude,
voyeurism and
a toilet flush.
toilet.
Yeah.
Could you
Flushing a toilet made people so uncomfortable.
Absolutely disgusting. But so listen, Psycho may not be, if you watch it today, it may not cause you fear in the same way that other scary movies do. I'm not saying that this is, the scariest horror movie that I could think of. But think about the story that it tells. First of all, it makes us uncomfortable in a couple of ways. We get this main character, the girl that she stole a whole bunch of money from her employer, right? So first of all, we get that she is dealing with this feeling of guilt,
right?
That all of us have experienced at some point. She's also trying to run from her past to an extent.
Right.
That is another cause of fear for a lot of people, both looking forward to the future and the unknown, but also looking back and reflecting on the past and the things that we've done that we're not proud of, or the consequences that we are trying to escape. But we always have the idea from the beginning of this film that the consequences are they can't be stopped. What's going to happen is going to happen. We know she's in trouble from the beginning, and you kind of get the idea she's not ever going to get out of trouble. Then we meet we meet Norman Bates, who's running this motel. And Norman Bates and his character have been spun off in so many different ways over the years. Really, this whole movie has, and we could probably talk for an hour about just the pop culture impact of this film and the impact that this film had on the art of filmmaking. But Norman Bates is a whole different kind of scary movie villain, if you will. We kind of understand that he's being controlled by his mother, and of course we get at the end one of the biggest plot twists in film history to this day, right?
Yeah.
But we also have a villain. We get this uneasy feeling from this guy, but in a way, we're also kind of forced to care about him. We're forced to sympathize with him, and that as a viewer, that kind of pains us. Neither of these main characters, from Lila Crane to Norman Bates, are really good people. There's no true protagonist. We see Lila, who did a terrible thing and is running from her past, and we see Norman Bates, who is doing all kinds of terrible things, but we have no choice but to kind of either pick a side or sympathize with both of them, put ourselves in the shoes of both of them. And that is what that's what makes this almost scary, is because of all of these potentially uncomfortable situations that it forces us to put ourselves in. And again, you add on top of that the if you put yourself in the shoes of the people viewing this when it was first released, you add on top of it the uncomfortable situation with the true threat of violence, which it does come to, and we see that.
Right.
And again, the film itself showing us all of these images that we would have never dreamed to even look at on screen in the year 1960.
Right.
Okay. I mean, I don't think I need to go too much more in depth. Psycho is what it has always been. And it has been, of course, talked about and studied over the decades, and it's timeless, and the story it tells has truly changed the horror genre forever. And who knows how many more recreations we will see of the story. But to this day, the original Psycho, the original story,
the OG one,
regardless of all the spin-offs and the remakes or whatever they are, this remains the best of them.
Yes.
Both as a horror film and also just as a film in general. And if you look at it from the right perspective, it truly can be a scary movie to watch.
I agree. And I agree because, I mean, from the start, it plays on one of I think a very common fear, which is the idea that you can't run away from your past.
Yep.
And this movie spins that and says, not only can you not run away from your past, but if you try to do that, there's a good chance something worse is going to happen to you.
Yeah.
And that is, I think, in a way that kind of introduced the idea of like, in horror at least, kind of nihilistic storytelling. The idea that it kind of just doesn't matter what you try to do. That whatever you try to do, no matter what you try, it's probably going to be futile. It's not going to matter anyway. I think that's one of the things that this, and I don't think Hitchcock necessarily wanted that to be what people took out of this movie, but I think it's kind of a common train of thought when you view Psycho. The idea that no matter what you try, if you try to run away, if you try to change things, you're probably still going to suffer some form of consequence. And in this story in particular, it's a consequence to the most extreme example.
Right. And that's what makes the effect of this movie, it makes it last, because fear and anxiety is basically that feeling of worry or unease about an imminent event or an uncertain future. Right. And you watch this movie and you realize that kind of that anxiety, instead of that feeling being eased, the movie basically says you were right. Something bad is going to happen. Right. And you can't do anything about it.
I think this movie also kind of pioneered the idea that horror can be a genre that pushes so many boundaries, that so many boundaries can be taken and subverted or just, completely disregarded, right? And this comes in a lot of ways through the violence and through the kind of helplessness of the storyline of what we think is going to be our main character, right? And that's one of another great thing this movie does is it kind of does a reversal where you think, your main character that you get set up for the first, it was like 30 or 40 minutes of the movie is dead by the end of the first act. Movies didn't really...
Spoiler alert.
Movies didn't really do that. Yeah, spoiler alert. What is this movie, 60 years old now? Movies, I don't think, that wasn't a very common thing. It was just another example of how this movie was trying to push the boundaries of what people thought, not just horror films, but films in general could be. And I think it really kind of opened the door for a lot of horror creators to really think about how they could push outside of what they thought they could do within this genre.
Yeah, absolutely.
I think this is a good kind of transition point into my number one pick, which is The Descent, because while these movies, on their face, these movies are definitely nowhere near the same in terms of narrative progression, characters, all that stuff.
I mean, really, based off of the
threat itself,
based off of the breakdowns we've done earlier in the week, these two are the most different out of all of our pairings.
But there are similarities I think you can take away.
Mm-hmm.
One of them being the idea that you cannot run away from your past.
Yeah.
And I think this is a very common thread in The Descent, because The Descent opens up with a very, and you had just recently watched this, so this is one of the things you first pointed out to me. There's a very effective death in the first 4 minutes of the movie. The main character, her husband, dies and gets a metal rod through his face.
Yeah.
But what's so effective about the opening of this movie is how it doesn't really linger on the gore or the actual traumatic, the physically traumatic moment. It shows it happen, and then what it lingers on is just the exterior itself.
I don't even think after we see the initial impact, if you will,
right.
I don't think we get another view of it. It doesn't.
No, we only get so when you get kind of a tracking shot up from the van, and you can kind of see the husband's body kind of writhing almost, but from that scene we immediately cut to a hospital where I believe our main character, Sarah, is in this hospital. She's unsure of where she is. She walks out into a hallway, kind of a green tinted hallway, and lights start shutting off, and she's running away from these dimming lights after dreaming of her daughter blowing out candles into blackness, right? And this scene, I think, is a great kind of foreshadowing for the entire rest of the movie, because it's such a wonderful visual cue to the fact that her daughter is also dead, because in this moment we don't know that her daughter is also dead. Right? This moment is what cues us into the fact that her daughter is dead, but it doesn't explicitly ever say your daughter is dead. Right? We see her daughter blow out the candles into the darkness. We see her running away from the darkness in this green-tinted hallway. And then she runs into the arms of her friend in a full-lit hospital hallway. That scene never actually happened. But we know, because of the way that setup kind of happens, that something more tragic than just her husband dying happened in that moment in the van when they're driving away from where they were in the opening scene. And that's one thing I love so much about this movie, and I feel is so undervalued about this movie, is there is so much showing going on in this movie. There is almost no telling, right? Neil Marshall, I believe it's Neil Marshall. Yeah, Neil Marshall wrote and directed this movie in 2005. And he does such a good job of using the setting and the atmosphere of which the characters are in to show us how they're getting to where they're going, what's going on, how they could be in peril. He never really uses moments to tell us specifically what's going on. There are moments of dialogue and kind of moments where the characters are trying to figure out what's going on.
Of course.
But there's never really an explicit moment where they get it all figured out and they kind of, get an explanation, or someone comes in and tells them what's going on. They only ever really kind of figure out a way to get out of the caves they eventually get trapped in, which is where obviously the majority of the film takes place when they go down into these caves. One of the girls decides to take them through a route that they've never done before with no known exits, and then they run into these humanoid, blind, I would say troglodytes, because troglodytes are cave dwellers, but they're just these humanoid creatures that are basically these blind, ravenous, basically animals with that were humans at one point. One thing I really love about this movie too is it really pushes the envelope with gore, with the effectiveness of gore, where there are a lot of scenes. Like there's one scene where Sarah, our main character, is running and she falls into literally a pool of blood. And you would think that's over the top, it's excessive, but Neil Marshall uses it as a moment to create this very effective, quiet scene where she slowly kind of comes up from out of the blood. It's almost like she's being baptized through like it's like baptism through fire, right? It's like a baptism through fire moment where she's in this blood, she comes out, and then she's able to escape after this, these interactions with two of these humanoid troglodyte things.
Yeah.
But like I said, all this, again, this all ties into kind of the idea that there's so much visual representation of fear and of progression, as opposed to a lot of other movies that just tell you what's going on.
Yeah.
And it's so also that, I talked about atmosphere. Atmosphere in this case has to do with the fact that they are in a claustrophobic environment.
Right.
And claustrophobia, I don't know about you, the idea of being trapped in a cave or buried alive in those claustrophobic environments, that's probably my number one fear.
Yeah.
Which is one reason why this movie is so high on the list for me, is because a lot of the fear that this film creates or produces has to do with the fact that these people are stuck in a environment that, one, they don't know, and two, is very small and crowded and hard to escape from.
Well, and I think that was so effective. This was one of the few movies that I can think of where watching, and it ties back into that kind of claustrophobia type idea. This is one of the few movies that actually made me feel like a physical response. I was watching that, and if you see a character get stuck in a tight space, or you see them in a cave with no way out, it makes you feel stuck yourself. I was watching it and I was just like so uncomfortable, and I was like, what?
Yeah.
Like that, like it was just disgusting watching that. But the scariest parts were not the gore.
No.
The scariest parts were watching a character get stuck in a hole while the rocks are collapsing around her.
Right.
Like that kind of thing.
Or,
and it just makes you feel you just want to get out of there.
Right.
And part of the thing with the gore, part of why it's not so gratuitous as it might seem, is that it's kind of like you mentioned from the beginning. It just kind of trudges along throughout.
Right.
It happens, and then we keep going.
Right.
And it happens, and we keep going, and it is growing exponentially throughout the film.
Right.
But we never stop to look back on, oh, like that was gross, that was bloody, that was violent. We are forced to, along with the characters, keep trying to fight our way out of this situation. And so it doesn't feel overbearing because we are never really given the time to stop and think about it from the beginning.
Right. And it's never really gratuitous for gratuity's sake, because here's the thing, they're using freaking pickaxes to kill these things. Of course it's going to be bloody. They're using super sharp objects to stab and slit through. Like, that's just what you think.
They're in a cave where hundreds, if not thousands, of animals and probably people have been killed before them. So we understand.
So, like, of course, a pool of blood makes sense.
It's going to be gross.
It's going to be nasty. It's going to be gross, and it's going to be grimy.
Yeah.
One thing I also wanted to touch on a little bit is, I think one of the other very effective things, I mentioned this at the beginning, the idea that you can't run away from your past, the twists that happen in this story throughout the kind of progression of the story itself are so indicative of that idea.
Right.
That no matter what you try to do, how you try to get over things, your past is always going to come. Your past is always going to be there. It's always going to be in the background, and sometimes it'll move back to the foreground. Sometimes your past.
You were about to say "come back to haunt you," but that's a little on the nose for a horror movie.
Right. But it does. It comes back to haunt you. It not only does it stay behind you, but sometimes it can get ahead of you. It can be, your past can be something you're moving towards.
Yeah.
And this movie does that a lot of times, especially with its main character Sarah, and I believe with the character, I think her name is Juno, which is I won't get too into spoilers here because this movie is only 15 years old and not 60. Psycho is, if you haven't seen Psycho, you're insane. But if you haven't seen The Descent, you're also insane.
If you haven't seen Psycho, you're probably not going to see Psycho.
Probably not at this point. A couple big twists happen with Sarah and Juno.
Yeah.
And one thing I really loved about this movie was the decisions that Sarah makes, because a lot of them they're shocking, but they're not outside the realm of someone who's going through a grief process. right?
Sure.
Sometimes characters make decisions in horror movies where you're like, that was stupid. Like, that was dumb. Why would he or she make that decision to get to the point they're at? But the shocking decisions that Sarah makes are less stupid and more shocking, because I think in some cases, like when I thought, oh, I honestly might have done that too.
Yeah, they're almost
like if I realized what I realized, if I
Sure.
was in a similar moment and the same revelations were given to me that were given to Sarah, there's a good chance I might make the same decision.
Yeah.
And that's one of the biggest, I think, elements of kind of true terror and kind of fear and horror that happened in this movie, is the fact that these kind of brash decisions that Sarah makes, especially in the third act, are very relatable.
Right.
Which sucks, because they're hard decisions, and they're decisions where you go, man, that's brutal.
They're hard to watch
unfold.
They're hard to watch unfold, and then realize that you might have done the same thing.
Right.
But you know, part of the idea of, you know, running from your past and having it catch up to you is also that even on this small scale, the actions of all of the characters have consequences.
Right.
And they're usually, in some ways you could argue, far worse than the original actions themselves. But part of that is that we're in this, we're claustrophobic in the physical sense, right? In this small space,
right.
But also in the sense that there's only a small group of people, and everything that you do is going to be found out. You are still human, right, after all, and even in the most the most extreme circumstances, you cannot stoop to the level of the monsters,
right?
And if you do, you will have to pay for that at some point. And that adds to the fear, because, like you said, we're watching that and we almost justify the actions in our minds.
Yes.
But at the same time, we're saying, how could you do something like that?
Right.
You are no better than blank, whatever.
Right. And I think this is, and I'll kind of wrap up with this. It's what makes the ending of this movie so effective. I mean, I won't spoil the whole thing, but, you know, Sarah gets out and she gets to the car and she drives down the road. And right at the very end, as a semi drives by and it makes her jump. And then we turn and we see Juno in the car with her, but Juno's still in the cave. And then we see her wake up in the cave still. And that just, again, it plays into the idea that moment where she sees her is cueing you back into the idea that the decisions she's made in the past are still going to catch up to haunt her. She cannot escape that decision she made in the past. And it snaps her back to reality, and the fact that she's not out. She's not out yet. She still has to figure out how to get out of that cave. And it leaves you with kind of that sense of, you get this kind of initial glimpse of hope that, oh, maybe she did make it. Maybe she got it. She figured it out. And then you're immediately hit with that dose of reality that this movie's been giving you from the first 4 minutes. The idea that no matter how fast you run, those lights are going to keep turning off as you try and run away. That darkness, you can't get away from that darkness. It's always going to be there.
Yeah.
It's not something you can just run away from. And that's one reason why I wanted you to watch all the way to the end. It's because I felt when I watched it, to me, it was one of the most like fully realized, effective endings of a horror film. Now, unfortunately, there's a Descent 2 and I believe a Descent 3, but I'll never watch those because to me, the original film is so complete.
Yeah. And so one last note that I kind of wanted to make on this movie is if and this is kind of speaking to whoever's listening to this, if you've watched horror movies and you've had the same kind of issues that we have had with them and brought up the same gripes that we have had with them about, you know, cheap scares and overused cliches and all of these things, this movie takes those and kind of turns them on their head. It gives an explanation for any cliche that it uses, right?
Right.
Everything that happens in this movie, of course, there's monsters and there's these, you know, predators living in the cave. Whatever it is, maybe that's not so realistic, but the idea of, you know, and it sounds silly because it's so simple, but we're walking around in a dark cave.
Right.
Of course, all we can see is what's in front of our flashlight.
Right.
Or, you know, the nightmares that the characters go through or have throughout the film. Mm-hmm. All things that we have probably experienced, right? And it's this slow burn where we get these glimpses of dread, and we are anticipating what's going to come next, and we mm-hmm. don't get the satisfaction of getting to stop and figure out what's happening. And so if classic horror movies are not really your thing, I think that this movie can still be so enjoyable. And I say classic not as in the classics, but like what horror has become. If that's not something that you enjoy, this movie is not that. You have to be able to look past the violence and the gore, and I would understand if you don't like that. But if you're looking for a truly unique experience, and I guess just to tie it together, both of these films that we talked about, I think they're so scary because what is haunting us is something that haunts everybody. Right.
It's something. Yeah. You're not being haunted by something supernatural or otherworldly. You're being haunted in these two films by something that exists in your mind.
And regardless of how the movie turns out, it is still exists for all of us in day-to-day life.
They're both so cerebral. And I think one reason why this is, I mean, The Descent is number one for me, and I completely agree with Psycho being number one, is because the fears that they play on are things that don't require something that is not as tangible in order to create the fear. It creates fear through some of the most tangible things that all humans go through or experience at some point in their life.
Exactly. You watch these films, and it's not the monsters that you are still afraid of when the movie ends.
Right.
It's not Norman Bates that you are still afraid of when the movie ends.
It's a lot of it is how you kind of examine yourself through the experiences.
They're very reflective, and they require you to reflect on your own fears, on how you might react in a similar situation. You cannot make it through either of these movies without at some point looking on yourself and kind of feeling bad about it. Right? It's hard to make it through this and feel good about yourself after watching it, and that's where the fear comes from.
Whether it's sympathy for Norman Bates or it's understanding the logic of decisions characters make in The Descent. It's it's things that when you kind of look inward and you tell yourself, I sympathize with that guy, or I understand why she did that. It creates feelings of kind of unease. Yeah, and it's one of the best examples of how you can create horror, I think, ever in general. Yeah. Just in a general sense. All right, man.
Well, I mean, I'm super happy with both of these as number ones. We talked kind of, this was a longer discussion, but rightfully so for our number ones.
Picks.
I have no problem with that.
No qualms whatsoever.
Do you want to wrap up our week here? And
oh yeah, wow. So we're at the end of this is it's Friday.
This is number 5.
Well,
for the week.
Thank you guys so much for listening. We had a lot of fun doing this, kind of breaking the last 2 weeks down into more of a series. With theaters still shut down and things that we can't control still going on, having kind of a structured set of weeks to discuss a topic and then kind of throw movies into that topic was, I think, for us, a lot of fun. Yeah. And we really enjoyed it. Plus, we're horror geeks, and it's Halloween season, so it really fit. The timing was perfect. We appreciate you guys listening. Be sure to hit that like, subscribe to our YouTube, subscribe to our podcast channels. We are on Apple. We are on Spotify. We are on pretty much any platform that you can find a podcast, including SoundCloud. That we use SoundCloud to actually host our podcast. So if you prefer being on SoundCloud, we're on there too. Give us a listen there. We really appreciate any and all listens, views on whatever platform you prefer. If you do listen to the podcast, please be sure to leave a 5-star review. Let us know what you think. Leave us some questions in the comments. Let us know what you think about the movies we've talked about this whole week. There are 9 different movies. All 9 I think that we very highly recommend.
Yeah.
And this is the first time we've talked about so many movies. Not only talked about so many movies, but talked about movies that we're like, please, like, you should watch this. Because a lot of the movies we reviewed so far, were, just new movies that we...
Well, and the first of us discussing a list of our top whatever. Like,
right.
we were both given kind of that freedom to hand pick 5 that we wanted to talk about. And that's why this week has been so exciting, because
right.
We're watching each other's picks. We're also getting the opportunity to really show each other and show the audience kind of what our interests are and how our mind works, especially when it comes to horror. So
right. And I mean, some of these movies probably exist on our all-time favorites lists, not just horror, but films in general. So again, thank you guys so much. We'll see you next week. Not really sure what we're going to talk about yet, but I'm sure it'll be long-winded and full of things you'll want to hear. So until then, we'll see you guys. Wow.
Bow.
Woo. That's a lot of movies.
We've been getting after is what we've been doing.
We've been grinding. The grind don't stop, bro.
It's a grind.
It's always a grind.